Hello, my sexy listeners. It's that podcast girl Cdub, and this is a podcast about house music. All right, Australia, no worries. I see you tuning in. Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, the Gold Coast, Adelaide, the Central Coast. I see you all in the numbers. I see you showing up on the Chromecast, streaming onto your smart TVs, into living rooms in your houses across a continent that sits beautifully far from where this music first caught fire. And I did not want to just say thank you and move on today. If I'm going to say your names, I want to understand what your dance floors felt like when the 80s turned into the 90s. I want to feel the temperature of it. I want to know how house music sounded when it had to travel thousands of miles to reach you. Because geography changes culture. Australia was not down the street from Chicago. It was not a train ride from New York. Records had to be imported. DJs had to wait. Scenes had to build without constant touring artists flying in every weekend. That kind of distance creates a certain kind of self-reliance. It forces a scene to listen closely to what it has and stretch it into something of its own. In Sydney, the late 80s and early 90s dance ecosystem was already alive with large-scale party culture. Events at places like the Hordern Pavilion carried a scale that allowed dance music to fill serious architectural space. At the same time, there was a strong LGBTQ+ underground energy shaping the floor. Queer spaces were not an afterthought. They were central. They were foundational. And they were where experimentation could breathe. And then there were the warehouses. Sydney had early warehouse raves that borrowed from what was happening in the UK and the US, but filtered through local networks, local crews, local bodies. Flyers moved through friend groups. Phone numbers were whispered. Locations were sometimes revealed close to the event. The feeling was part anticipation, part pilgrimage. You drove and you found it. You stepped inside and the bass hit differently because you had earned your way there. When I picture those floors, I don't imagine them trying to imitate Chicago or New York. I imagine a room full of people who knew they were building something slightly off-center from the global map. The music might have been imported, but the energy was domestic. The sweat was local. And then Melbourne. Melbourne in the 90s developed a reputation for a serious warehouse culture. All-night events, named party brands that meant something to the people who went every month. One series that still gets spoken about is Every Picture Tells a Story, which ran through the early and mid-90s as an all-night electronic gathering. The name alone feels cinematic. You can almost see it, the lights cutting through industrial space filled with fog, the bass bouncing off concrete, the bodies settling into marathon rhythm. Melbourne crowds had such stamina. That is something you hear again and again in oral histories. People showed up knowing they were there for the long arc of the night. They did not arrive for a quick peek. They arrived to stay. That kind of culture shapes the way DJs play. It shapes the way dancers pace themselves. It shapes how house and techno blend into one another over 6, 8, 10 hours. It shapes what you wear. And by the mid-90s, the music was no longer invisible. In 1995, the ARIA Awards introduced a Best Dance Release category. The first winner was Itchy and Scratchy for Sweetness and Light. That moment matters. It signals that what had been living in warehouses and underground parties had reached national visibility. Dance music was not just subculture, it was part of Australia's recorded history. It was being formally recognized. At the same time, something else was unfolding. Australia's landscape is vast, open, and wild, and it makes sense that dance culture would eventually stretch outward into that geography. The early 90s saw the growth of outdoor party culture that later became known as Bush Doof. These gatherings were often rooted in rave networks and evolved into events that intersected with house, techno, trance, and psychedelic-influenced sounds. They were about sound systems in open air, long drives, sunrise light hitting faces that had not slept all night. While city clubs held that pulse, the bush carried another current, the sense that dance music could exist beyond walls, that it could exist under sky. What moves me about Australia's story is that it never feels like a copy. It feels like a translation. House music traveled across oceans and then landed in a place that had its own pace, its own terrain, its own communities already. Sydney carried scale and queer underground roots. Melbourne had warehouses and long-form intensity. The Bush Doof had space and horizon. And now, decades later, I see you listening. Sydney holding steady, Melbourne climbing, Perth, I see you appearing. That jump from East Coast to West Coast is not small. It feels symbolic to me. It feels like the continent itself is leaning in, and I want you to know that I see you. So email me at ThatPodcastGirl Cdub at gmail.com. If you were there in the 80s or 90s, today, tell me your story. Tell me the venue that's changing your life. Tell me the DJ who shaped your nights. Tell me that first track that made you realize, shit, house music is more than a party. I want to build this with you. This podcast started as something intimate for me, a way to document me falling in love with a culture through someone that I loved. But it has grown into something wider, and if it is going to travel internationally, I want to do it respectfully. So Australia, this one's for you. I'm that podcast girl Cdub, and this is a podcast about house music. Until next time, keep the beats alive.